Hi, my name is Mariana Castro, and in this piece, I will be discussing what English language proficiency levels are and what they mean for educators. During this video, we will begin by giving an overview of what WIDA is and its role in educating language learners. And we will very briefly talk about who English learners or English language learners are and what English language proficiency levels are. We'll talk about how they're determined, how you can use them as educators, and what are some things that you might want to consider when you're using them. So let's start with discussing what WIDA is. WIDA is an organization that is formed by member states. This organization is actually housed in the School of Education right here at UW-Madison, and it's part of the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. WIDA's mission is to advance academic language development and academic achievement for students who come from culturally and linguistically diverse children. And it does so through high-quality standards, assessments, research, and professional development for educators. So based on that mission, WIDA has developed standards for English for K through 12 schools. It has also developed Spanish language development standards for K through 12 schools, as well as pre-K standards for children who are between the ages of 2.5 to 5.5, and in both English and Spanish. It has also developed a variety of language proficiency assessments, specifically in English, for K through 12 grade. And it also provides to their member states professional learning, both face-to-face, like in the forms of workshops or trainers, as well as professional learning that happens through technology. So it can be something that is independent study, like webinars or live webinars that you can access at certain times. It has also developed, under this umbrella of professional learning, a lot of resources and tools for teachers to use as they are planning for instruction of English learners. WIDA also engages in policy support for the consortium, as well as quantitative and qualitative research. As you can see from this picture, WIDA has about 40 state agencies that are part of the consortium. The majority, as you can tell, are states, although some are districts, like the District of Columbia, and some are territories, like the Northern Mariana Islands or the U.S. Virgin Islands. And then we have some states that just are a conglomerate of schools, like the Bureau of Indian Education, which is a group of schools across the U.S., or the Department of Defense that has schools across the world. In addition to the WIDA consortium, we also have a WIDA International School Consortium. So these are just American schools or international schools where the medium of instruction is English, and the schools have independently chosen to use our standards and purchase assessment from us. And they're part of this large WIDA International School Consortium that has over 400 schools that are members. So with that backdrop, our focus is serving the education of English language learners, as we mentioned. So you might have already read a lot about who these students are. These multilingual students receive this label, English learner or English language learner, when they have been identified as being eligible for a language support in school, a language program. English learners are a subgroup that actually is recognized by both state and federal laws. So there's a process for identification and a process for exit of the program, or what they call reclassification. Under the federal government, there's this reauthorization that is called Every Student Succeeds Act. And under it, states must assess English learners every year to see what their level of language proficiency is and be able to show the acquisition of English over time. Part of this law is also that the students must receive reasonable accommodations when they're taking assessments at state level that are content related. And they need also to show that they've developed an accountability system that includes both long-term goals as well as measures about how students are making progress towards those goals. So one of the ways in which they show how students are acquiring more and more English is through showing how year to year their English language proficiency increases. Currently, in Wisconsin, schools are using the WIDA standards. So the measure that they use are these WIDA English language proficiency levels. And you can see they go from 1 through 5. And once they've gone through 5.9999, they become a 6. However, many times the states that are members might not choose that as their exit point because there are many different things they take into account. Really, a student is identified as an English learner when they need that additional language support, because language is one of the main impediments for them to be able to just participate meaningfully in learning. So if a student, if one of the, of course, for anybody who's multilingual, language will always be a factor, right? It will always might always need supports. But when it's one of the primary factors, then that's when the law kicks in. And then as a school, you need to provide them with supports. So schools sometimes deem that exiting a student until they reach that 6 at the end, that 5.999, that is just not realistic. So some states have chosen an exit point of 5.5 or 5.0 or sometimes even 4.8, and they have additional criteria. But these levels of language proficiency in general are what helps them communicate both exit criteria as well as language development to the federal government. So as a definition or as an explanation of what language proficiency levels are, is we can think about them as delineating the expected language performance. And they describe what English learners can do within a particular language domain. And what we mean by domain is listening, speaking, reading, and writing. These are the domains that the federal government wants to hear about. They want to know what a student's language performance is in listening, what about speaking, reading, and writing. So as you can imagine, a student could have a different proficiency level, and most likely they have a different language proficiency level for listening, then speaking, then reading, and writing. And now I want to spend a little more time thinking about what do we mean by language performance? What is it that we're looking at? What is it that we're assessing or what is it that we mean when a student's at level 2? So the way we look at this is we really focus on how students are using language. So language performance means how students are using language in schools for the purpose of learning. So for example, in this case, this particular student is studying circuits. What might be the language that this particular student needs to communicate with her teacher about the particular circuits? Or how might these two students use language to communicate with each other as they are conducting a lab experiment? Or what is the language that students need to understand what both their teacher as well as peers or any other adult are saying, and how they use that to understand the content. So how they use language to mediate their understanding of the content. So what kind of things do students use language to in schools? You can imagine they use language to retell stories. So you can imagine the types of language, the types of words and structures that students might use as they're retelling a story, right? If you're retelling a story, you might be using a lot of past tense. You might be talking about the beginning of the story, the middle of the story, or the end of the story. But that's not all. As you go in and out of classes, sometimes you're comparing and contrasting points of view. And that might look differently when you're doing it for an author in English versus when you're doing it in social studies, or when you're explaining phenomena. That requires a different type of language, not just because the content has changed, the phenomena has changed, but the ways in which we use language changes as we're going from retelling to explaining. Or when we're engaging in meaning making or in higher order thinking with peers as we're doing critical thinking, or we're negotiating that meaning. The way we use language in interaction with others just sounds very different. So for all of these things, what changes are various things. And this is kind of like a visual representation of what changes. And I'm going to start with the bullets at the very bottom. If you can see, we talk about language happening within particular contexts for language use. So language happens, as you can see, different registers, different genres, topics. Basically, the way we use language is always dependent on when we're using it, for what purpose, with whom. Um, and you probably have already thought about this, or you have read already about this, that as you're talking, for example, with a friend, the way you use language is going to be different than when you're using language with a professor, even if you're talking about the same topic. Um, there are particular genres in school that require us to use language, or that, are kind of like expectations for us to use language in particular ways. We talked about narrative or poetry. The topic also influences how we use language. As we talked about the situation or the task, if I'm writing an email for a friend, it's going to be different than if I'm writing a text to that friend, or if I'm writing a letter to that friend. So it's not always who I'm talking to, but how I'm communicating with them, as well as the particular identities or social roles that kids have in schools. So if I am in a class where my teacher is constantly providing lectures, I need to develop much more my listening skills, right? And I'm using language in particular ways. And that's going to be very different from being in a classroom where my teacher is expecting me to work a lot in small groups. And now I have to figure out different ways of using language. And I'm talking about language more than just the words that are coming out of my mouth, to include also how I behave, how do I take the floor, how do I invite others into the conversation, etc. So with that as the backdrop, we make choices, as you can imagine, about how we use words, right? About the particular words that I use, about the particular expressions that I use. So at the very bottom of this colorful little table, you can see the word phrase level. So depending on who I'm talking, I may use more general vocabulary or more technical language, depending on the situation, right? But it's more than just those words. You can think about language also from the perspective of the grammatical structures that we use. As I had mentioned, if you remember, we were talking about retelling a story. I will typically use past tense type of constructions. If I'm telling a story versus I'm writing a text, I will also be thinking a lot more about how I organize that. So then I get into the discourse level. How much language I'm using, and how am I structuring that language? How am I organizing it to make it more coherent? How much density I'm providing. When we talk, we do a lot of repetition. We use a lot of just loose language, I could say. Whereas when we write, we are much more intent about organizing our text. So our language might be more dense. There's much more meaning within particular words. So as you can see, thinking about the language that students use is not just listening for the words they're using, but it's more about how those words are put together in sentences and in the larger discourse. And it's also about matching all that to particular purpose for using language, and for thinking constantly about who am I preparing my language for? Who am I producing sentences, or who am I talking to? Who am I writing for, etc. So it's quite a complex system that or process that we have to do. And because we've used language for all these years, we just feel very comfortable with it. As we learn new languages, we need to learn not just the new words, but we need to learn the new structures, and we need to learn about what it makes sense in how we organize speech or text for others, right? So we need to think about the cultural implications as well as the linguistic implications of how we use language. So that definition of language is used to define each of these levels. So when I think about whether my students are level 1, 2, or 3, what I'm assessing is, again, not just the words, but I'm also assessing the structures. I'm also assessing the discourse. So I'm assessing those 3 levels for each of those, at each of those levels. and I'm thinking constantly about the purpose for language use. So how my choice around discourse features, around sentence features, and about words, it matches the situation. So this is one more visual representation of this. As you can see, this page is organized in the same dimensions that we discussed before. There's a discourse, there's a sentence, and then the word phrase dimensions. Those are my columns. So when I'm thinking about discourse dimension, I'm thinking about that linguistic complexity. If you remember, is that how we're organizing, how much language we're using. The sentence dimension are those language forms and conventions. They're my past tenses, they're my clauses, they're my putting together words into sentences. And then my last column is about what the type of words and how I'm using those words or phrases. And for each of those dimensions, what this table does, it describes what that looks like as students develop more language. So I'm just going to read for an example. If you look at level 1, and when we're talking about discourse dimensions, as we go up, if you remember, what's going to change is the amount of language and is the complexity of language, right? So you can see here that from level 1, it goes from words, phrases, or chunks of language. By the time students at level 2, they're using more phrases and short sentences. And then students start using short, complete sentences. Sometimes they use expanded sentences. Eventually, they start using more complex sentences, and the amount just is more and is more complex. You can see the second bullet is about how they're representing ideas and how much detail they're providing and how they're starting to organize them and think about cohesiveness, right? So they're not just saying a bunch of sentences in a row, but they're thinking about, okay, it might make it more cohesive if I add some connectors, or the use of pronouns so something is not as repetitive. You can look at the same type of progression from the sentence dimension. You can see how you go from phrase level grammatical structures, so thinking about is something plural or is something singular, to maybe some more repetitive formulaic expressions like, oh, I like this, I like that, I like, and it's always like, right? But eventually my grammatical structures start to also become more complex. I go into more simple, compound, complex grammatical structures. And I also start using a broader range of sentence patterns. So it's not just about more, but it's about more choices, more diverse. So it's not just being able to retell a story in past tense, but what are the various ways in which I can retell a story? Or what are the various ways in which I can talk about tense? So as students' language becomes more sophisticated, it becomes more varied. I have more ways of telling a story. So it's not just longer stories. Or I have more ways of talking about comparing, contrasting different ideas. And you can see the same type of progression finally on vocabulary. You go from more general content related words to maybe sometimes language that is more specific to the particular topic, to more highly technical vocabulary. So the way these levels are determined, as I have discussed a little while ago, is by an assessment. And we're going to talk today about the Access for ELLs. This is assessment that English learners in WIDA states take once a year. So once a student is identified as an English learner, that student needs to be assessed every year until they show that they've exited the program, that they don't need those additional language resources anymore. As you can imagine, for some students, this is a big help, but for some students, this kind of comes attached to a stigma. So you will hear often either parents or students asking, how can I get out of the program, or can I refuse services? Students can refuse services, but they have to continue to be assessed. That's part of federal law. They have to receive this assessment because the state needs to show that they're providing supports. And this is very different from, for example, special education, where you can refuse to have your child assessed or tested for disabilities. For language, by law, once they know a student needs that support, or many times this is when the student is first entering schools, they are completing this home language survey. So once they complete that language survey, if the school identifies the student as being exposed to another language, then they have to receive the assessment, and the assessment indicates whether they need the support or not. So it's a multi-step process in which a student completes the home language survey, or more likely their family completes the home language survey, and if there's another language evident, then the student has to take the assessment. If the student receives a particular score or under that score, then they're eligible for services, and then the services are offered, and the assessment is given every year. So that first assessment is the screener, but once the students are assessed every year, they take this assessment called Access. And the assessment has 4 parts, so each part is one of the language domains. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of accountability around this. So students receive an ID, and every year they try to match the same ID to the student to make sure that we're receiving the information, because the idea is to track how well that particular groups of students are doing. So as I mentioned, you have 4 parts of the assessment: the listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And then out of those questions, by the way, they are stated in the same way that I described before. The students are given a particular task to do with language. So it's always attached to a particular purpose for language use, whether it's compare and contrast, whether it's describe, whether it's justify. And based on how they use language, remember, words, phrases, discourse, how they use that language to justify, or how they use that language to describe, students are given particular scores. Those scores are what I would call raw scores, right? But the raw scores are not enough, because some items are more difficult than others. So you can imagine that the items being given a particular number of points. So it's not just scoring that a particular number of items correctly, but it's what items did you score correctly, and how much are each of those items are worth. And that comes up once you do all the math, comes in something called the scale score. So to the right hand, in the right hand column, what you can see is the scale score. So the scale score for student in listening is 368. This particular student scored 320 for speaking, etc. That score is then translated into a proficiency level. And those are more kind of socially convened type of scores. So teachers for particular grade levels then come and say, well, a score of 368 for 3rd grade, for example, is worth a 4.0. But maybe that same score for a student who is in 2nd grade would be higher. But for a student who is in 9th grade, that score would be lower. So as grade levels go up, the expectation is that students use language in more sophisticated ways. So as you can see here, you have proficiency levels out of this report. This is a report that the teachers would be able to see. You have the score for each of the listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Then we have in white at the bottom, we have these what we call composite scores. And composite scores are not necessarily part of the test, but they are derived from these language domains. So you can see here that the oral language is derived from listening and speaking. Your literacy is derived from reading and writing. And your comprehension is from reading and listening. Notice that for comprehension, there's a heavier weight on reading. And this was decided by the state members because they wanted a heavier emphasis on the literacy, because a lot of the tests that the students have to take are literacy based. And you can see that again in the overall score. The overall score, there's a heavier emphasis on reading and writing, 35% for each, than for listening. There's only 15% of each. As you can see, many times you may have heard a students at level 3 or students at level 4. The overall composite just is a good number for accountability, but it's not as descriptive of what students can do because, as you can see, because of the weight. So you can see that for listening, this student is much higher. And look at the student's ability in speaking. They're going to need much more support because they're a level 2 than what you would think if you only focus on the overall score, because you would think, oh, this student is at level 3 across the board. So it's important as you look at proficiency levels, one of the considerations that I would say is never look at the number in isolation, at just a single number overall score, but always try to look for more information, like what can they do with listening, what can they do with speaking, reading, and writing, etc. Each of the reports contains usually an explanation of what each of these levels means. So it tells you what students at this level generally can do. This is meant to just give you a starting point. WIDA has produced other resources. There are some things called the can-do descriptors, where they give you much more information of what a student at level 4 can typically do. Again, a word of caution. The word generally is there very intentionally. It doesn't, the fact that the student is a level 4 doesn't always mean that they can do all of this. They might be able to do more, or they might be able to do less, because the summative assessment is just one point in time, and the summative assessment changes every year. However, it just has so many questions. You can imagine that you can't create a test that would have every single question possible to determine a number. So it's just a sample of questions. So many times that sample can hit it right there for that particular student because they're familiar with that content. Other times, some of those topics the student might not be familiar with. So then they don't do as well in that particular test. And because it's a large-scale test and it's given to many, many students, and it's given around the same time every year, what you're looking for is patterns, but you don't look at numbers individually. So how can knowing these numbers help me? So as an educator, you can think about the language students need to follow your directions. So you can start thinking about the language that you're using in response to the levels. You can think about the language that students needs to understand the explanation of the use of graphs to describe the relationship between two functions, or to explain it themselves, or to read and write a critique on a book on a 10th grade English class, or participate in a Socratic seminar. So you can use the language, the numbers, the levels, to think about how to modify your instruction. So when you're planning, you can almost be thinking ahead of time, or be kind of predicting where your student may need additional support. It can also help you group students together, or think about listening to a particular student and thinking about what a student can do. Or you can look at students' writing and look at their samples, and based on the type of words that they're using, or looking at the type of structures that they're using, you yourself can conduct some assessment based on those performance definitions. There's also rubrics aligned to those levels. So you can also use these resources not just to know about the students, but to provide additional data around the students. We talked about how the summative assessment once a year is just a sliver, right? You're just, in an hour, you're making big inferences about what students can do with language. Providing more information, triangulating that data, adding that information. So if I give a writing assessment 4 times a year, maybe I can use those same writing assessments to look at the language and think about what type of words they're using, what type of structures they're using, and get a glimpse more at what is the actual everyday or a more, I would say, a more defined look at the language proficiency of students. Finally, I want to just talk about a few considerations. Number one, an English language proficiency level is basically the result of an annual summative assessment. If you were to take a test in social studies or in math and you get a score of 3, that does not necessarily reflect you as a mathematician or as a math student, because that is just a test that assesses a particular amount of knowledge. Same thing here. It's just giving you kind of like a compass on things to pay more attention to. Another thing is that language proficiency varies depending on the context. You will notice if you work with students throughout the day that if you teach a couple of classes for that student, you might notice that maybe in your ESL class, they feel more comfortable, they're using more language. Maybe they love reading, they have more vocabulary around that, but in your math, they don't know about the terms. Or opposite, maybe they are really good at math and they feel more comfortable and they're more willing to take risks. So even if they don't know enough language, they're willing to take risks and may appear more proficient than in a reading class where there's so much language that they may become overwhelmed. Some kids are just better at oral language than literacy. Some kids are more, and I'm using literacy in a very narrow way, I'm just talking about written literacy, but some kids may have received much more instruction in English and they are able to write more than they are able to speak. Finally, language development takes time and it's very individual. It's connected to our own experiences with language. So that the language development from student to student might change. So just a lot of things to think about. Please email me if you have additional questions, or talk to your instructor, and I can answer questions around language proficiency levels or about other questions you may have that are related to standards and assessments at WIDA. Thank you very much and have a wonderful time.